Hi viewers, in this video I went to see my brother and I decided to film and help him to replace the hub bearing assembly on his daughter's Kia Soul 2011.
The hub assembly that had to be replaced was on the right rear side. The 5 lug nuts were loosened before the car was lifted. The wheels on the other side of the car were blocked for safety and the jack stand was used to secure the working area. Once it was done, we removed the lug nuts and the wheel. The 2 bolts that held the floating caliper were removed. The caliper pads were loosened by hand as shown, but it could have been done with the help of a prying tool. The floating caliper was placed in a safe position. Usually people use a bungee cord to attach the loose part on the coil spring. The 2 bolts were unscrewed. Note that the upper retaining bolt was longer than the other one because of the thickness of the guide plate. To save time, the caliper bracket was removed with the pad still on. Then the rotor was ready to be removed. The 2 retaining screws located on the face of the rotor were unscrewed. Also note that the parking brake must be released to be able to remove the rotor. For this job, the shoe adjuster could not be used to release the parking brake shoes because it was completely rusted and seized. It was not possible to remove the rotor by hand. We needed some tools. After hammering and pulling with a pry bar, the rotor was finally pulled out. The speed sensor cable connector had to be unplugged. It was the moment to do it because it was easily accessible. Note that the connector retaining clip must be removed to unplug the connector. Before the 4 hub assembly bolts were removed, we paid attention on how the speed sensor connector and the backing plate were installed. We used a ratchet with a 14mm socket to do the job. If it's too hard to unscrew, an extension tube can be used to ease the job. If 1 or more bolts are frozen, the shoes should be removed to get access to heat the hub assembly flange around the bolts. As you can see, when the last bolt was removed, the guide plate was getting loose. The rust was holding all the parts together and the backing plate was stuck on the rear axle mounting surface. We had to use the hammer to release the backing plate. Even with penetrating oil and strong hammering, we were not able to separate the hub assembly from the backing plate. We decided to go for plan B. We also hit quite hard on the 4 bolts that we installed behind the hub assembly. Again, nothing moved and we were not successful. It was time to go for plan C. We removed the parking brake components to make some room to beat on the hub. Anyways, they had to be removed because they were too rusted. Since the parking brake job was not planned and we were short on time, the parking brake shoes removal and the installation were not filmed. Anyways, I drew some illustrations and I filmed extra generic clips to explain the following steps. To have a good grip on the rusted retaining parts, we used my modified pliers. With my custom-made pliers, it was very easy to unhook the upper retaining springs and the lower retaining spring. We paid attention on how the adjuster assembly was positioned and assembled, so we could reinstall it properly. Because regular pliers were too big to fit in the space, we used my custom pliers to remove the spring caps. The spring pin must be held from behind while the cap is pushed and rotated to get unlocked. Remember the position of the brake strut assembly before the shoes are removed. When all the holding components are uninstalled, the parking brake shoes can be removed. The other step is to detach the parking brake cable from the brake shoe lever. The upper brake shoe guide plate was removed. With the parking brake shoes removed, there's a lot of space to hit harder. The plan was good and the hub assembly is finally freed from the backing plate. Because the stores were closing soon, it was time to go and get the parts that were ordered by phone. At the first store, where my brother bought his hub assembly, he compared the new one with the old one to make sure it was the same model. At the second store, he also took the time to compare the brake shoes. Back home, most of the rusted parts were brushed or sanded and reinstalled with the new shoes. When the parking brake cable was attached and the parking brake shoes were installed on the backing plate, it was time to install the hub assembly. The round bearing section of the hub assembly was inserted in the backing plate hole. The wheel speed sensor connector was facing the harness plug side. Note that the forward lower bolt was the first one to be installed to hold the assemblies together. Those bolts were torqued at 50 foot-pounds. After the torquing, it was time to reconnect the wheel speed sensor. The parking brake shoe adjuster was adjusted properly to fit with the rotor. Once the rotor was in position, the two remaining screws were installed and torqued at 4 foot-pounds. To mount the caliper bracket, note that we used the longer bolt for the upper attachment. The two bolts were torqued at 50 foot-pounds. After that, the old brake pads were reinstalled on the caliper bracket. The piston was compressed and it was easy to insert the floating caliper in place. The two guide bolts were installed and torqued at 20 foot-pounds. The wheel was installed and it was time for the road test. This hub assembly replacement was an emergency and the complete brake job was done later during the week.
I hope you liked this presentation and that you are more prepared should you have to deal with rusted parts and cold conditions.